Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDx London experts in under 5 minutes.
In this week's Climate Quickie, we delve into what's likely to happen in 7 years' time if we don't ramp down on our funding and exploration of fossil fuel projects, with Mark Campanale, the founder of non-profit think tank Carbon Tracker Initiative. He's been working on something called carbon budgets, calculations which tell us how much CO2 can be put into the atmosphere before we break through the conditions associated with 1.5 degrees of warming, which were outlined in the Paris Agreement. Which begs the question, why are investors, banks and pension funds pouring hundreds of billions of dollars a year into funding more oil, coal and gas projects? Let's head over to Mark to hear more. Stay curious.
Yeah, so, Carbon Tracker, when we got going, the thing that got me thinking hard, and the trigger for this, so can I go a little back to some of the origins?
Take us to a story.
Is I saw a company being listed on the London Stock Exchange, two companies actually. One was called Asia Energy. It was building one of Asia's biggest coal-fired power stations. It was in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the countries underwater. And then around the same time, a company called Xstrata, which is just a coal company, was listing in London. It's now called Glencore. And I saw a whole parade of coal and oil and gas companies coming to the London stock market. And I thought, well, okay, some of them might be able to develop their coal, but not all of them. And that led to the idea of just finding how many coal companies are trying to raise money, how many are there, and how many more can develop their reserves before we tip over these climate thresholds. And that took us to the work of carbon budgets. How much CO2 can be in the atmosphere before we go over 1.5 degrees of warming? We've got over the highest concentrations of CO2 in 400,000 years. So how much more can we go? And the science is not exact on this, but it's around 300 gigatons. It's millions of tons of carbon dioxide.
So to clarify, this is how much we can burn, we think, and stay below the 1.5 degrees.
Now, to put that into context, we're emitting around 41 gigatons of carbon dioxide from burning coal and oil and gas. So the maths is pretty simple. That means we've only got 6 or 7 years left before we break through the conditions associated with 1.5 degrees. And then for 2 degrees, we've got about another decade or two. Now, we've got to bear in mind, we've not seen these conditions for hundreds of thousands of years. The last time we had that kinds of concentrations of carbon dioxide, everyone knows that London was a steamy swamp, which is why you found alligators and hyena bones and alligator bones in London, because, of course, London was a steamy swamp. Now we've got this kind of condition that we think is normal, but actually for hundreds of thousands of years, London wasn't like that. We're going back to the preconditions associated with that kind of environment. So we've got around 7 or 8 years left based on those kinds of emissions. So which begs the question, why are investors, the banks and the pension funds, pouring literally hundreds of billions of dollars a year into finding more? It doesn't make any sense. So Carbon Tracker, we looked at Shell, BP, Exxon, Chevron, all of the others, and we said, okay, what reserves do you control? You can look this up. Carbontracker.org, you can go and see on our website. The companies have around 1,000 gigatons of CO2 in their reserves, okay? So that is 3 times more than the carbon budget. But of course, companies don't own most of the reserves. Most of the reserves are owned by governments. So they own another 2,000 gigatons. So there we go. 3,000 gigatons of CO2 in the known reserves of coal, oil and gas. There's 300 gigatons left of carbon budget, so there's your answer. The answer is
10 times
90% of the world's fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground for us to avoid catastrophic warming. We're already seeing warming at 1.1. It's looking awful. The images today of the Amazon on fire are just unbelievable. The satellite images, just Google Amazon on fire. Not now, but have a look. It's deeply worrying.
Not if you want to have a good day.
So when we get to 1.5 degrees, and we're on a pathway based on the national determined contribution, these commitments governments have made, based on our analysis of the plans of the oil and gas majors like Exxon and Chevron, we're well on the way to 2.3 and beyond of warming, it's going to be a catastrophe. So the urgency to stop these projects is compelling, whether it's you're doing it with your pension plan or you're sitting in the street with XR or you're making your protests. We have to get people's attention focused on this. So the remarkable news is for me, the energy system is going to get smaller. And once you've paid off for the cost of your solar and your wind, the cost of your energy is essentially going to be zero. It's going to be the maintenance costs. So the cost of energy is going to drop. And this was the promise. Remember, this was the promise of nuclear, but it wasn't true. It was never going to be true. But this is the promise of wind and solar, is we're going to have a resource which is going to change everything politically, economically, for households. And it's going to change the way financial markets are going to have to think, because we're moving from a fossil-based system, which Carbon Tracker, we estimate that all that coal-fired power and oil and gas and pipelines and railways is worth around $30 trillion. And over the next decade, when we get to net zero, cut emissions by 50%, we're going to have to replace all of that with a new system that's going to be better, more efficient, more reliable. And there's technologies we're going to have to get right. Battery storage is the obvious one, but we can solve this. We don't need gas in the home. We don't need gas for cooking or even heating. So all these things are for us to look forward to, and they will happen in our lifetime.
Thanks for listening to this Quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDx London. Until next time,
stay curious.